We speak now to international relations expert Aaliyah Vayez for more. Aaliyah, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. I mean, listening to Reverend Frank Chigane, he raises some really important points. I mean, one such is the suspicions of this entire ceasefire agreement, that Israel might be accepting it for strategic reasons. I mean, he speaks about how there are right-wing elements in the cabinet who want the war to resume, but are happy in phase one to see hostages being released. I mean, what do you make of that?
Thank you so much for having me this evening, and I completely agree with a lot of what Reverend Chikane said. I think when we talk about strategic reasons, we can think of it as a kind of double-sided coin, where on one hand, when we consider domestic Israeli politics, 100% there are far-right, two at least far-right parties within the current Israeli parliament that are staunchly against the ceasefire agreement and actively, want the genocide to continue, and absolutely disagree with what the Israeli kind of negotiation efforts have achieved alongside others in the past couple of days. And I think it's worth mentioning that these are not just, these may be minority parties like the Religious Zionist Party, but one of its members is the finance minister, Smotrich. Another, the police minister, Ben Gvir. They are high-level supporters of the continuation of what's happening along the Gaza Strip. And then on the other side, in Paul, we've got, everything that's happening around the President Trump's, impending inauguration. We've had so many reports about Trump offering, the Israeli government, or rather Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, gifts after, for example, after the hostages are released and the kind of first phase of the ceasefire deal has concluded successfully. So, we're taking an already volatile and fragile situation and placing a ceasefire agreement that is in and of itself hasn't even been approved by the Israeli cabinet and Israeli parliament as such.
Yeah.
So I think that Israel may be pursuing multiple strategic kind of objectives through this, many of which don't fundamentally at all speak to the end of not only the genocide, but the occupation of Palestinian territories.
It's important that you emphasize that, nothing has been agreed to per se. I mean, the three-phase deal, we know, is set to begin on Sunday, but many of its details of the timeline remain unclear. As you speak about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, we know that he's said that he's not willing to comment until all the details are finalized. So what we have seen, though, the agreement to pause the war and in Gaza and release the hostages, we've seen at least 83 people in Gaza since that announcement was made being killed. That in itself marks the highest daily death toll in over a week. I mean, how should we begin to interpret the elements that make up the reaction to this agreement?
I think, again, there's two ways you can look at this, Mpo. And on the one hand, it is completely within, Israel's historic character and its historic treatment of Palestinians to scale up the level of violence and sheer destruction on Palestinian people and Palestinian lives right before a moment of calm or a moment of peace, or in this case, ceasefire. So it is absolutely unsurprising that within the hour the ceasefire was announced yesterday evening, at least 30 Palestinians were brutally murdered across the Gaza Strip. And I think I will say that on the more optimistic side, we must not fail to recognize the Palestinian hope and resilience that has been, spread across social media and across media outlets from the announcement of a ceasefire. I think, in the coming hours, there has been glimpses of hope, and we cannot let that die because of the pessimism and the historical character, brutal historical character of the current and past Israeli regime.
A lot has also been mentioned, Aaliyah, around the human rights violations when it comes to the number of deaths that we're seeing, and the ripple effects. What do you make of that as we take stock of what could happen? I mean, we're yet to really know what will happen.
I think, Paul, I think you and I and the rest of the world are really waiting on what, the devil is in the details, as they say. This ceasefire agreement is coated in humanitarian concern and diplomatic, language, which is expected, but how it does not fundamentally address larger questions like the ongoing settler violence across the West Bank, the, absolute embedded machinery of Israeli occupation across Palestinian occupied territories, the question of Palestinian self-determination and sovereignty and self-governance has not been addressed, has not even been, whispered around the likes of a ceasefire. And, I'm aware you cannot overload a negotiation on a conflict that is already so fragile and volatile. However, we cannot, as a global community, embolden Israel and embolden, a negotiation process so much so, along with actors like the US that have, absolutely funded the genocide that we've seen with over $17 billion in security aid and arms sales. We cannot turn a blind eye to the fact that the machinery of occupation and of genocide continues to be in place. And it brings me to another point, is that the monitoring mechanism that is in place for the ceasefire, the implementation of the ceasefire is being monitored by the US, by Egypt, and by Qatar from Cairo. My question is, where are the local voices? Where are the people, the Palestinian people that are being subjected to these terms? Because it is the on the ground witnessing that will really tell the story.
Yeah, as you ask that question, one really tries to comprehend on how solid is the ceasefire. We know that phase 1 starts on Sunday and it's set to last for 6 weeks, but the second and third phases are less developed. The details are not there to really comprehend on how stable this is and, who's to be held accountable for its implementation.
100%, Paul, and I think, as far as we know, that only 16 days after the first phase begins on Sunday, which we don't even have the hour of implementation for as yet, 16 days after, that's when we know the negotiators will go back to the negotiating table and kind of finalize those terms around the second and potential third phase, which all we know will include a further withdrawal of Israeli military forces from the Gaza Strip, as well as, further exchange of hostages and, Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah.
However, I think, and mentioned in, our country's, DIRCO's statement regarding the ceasefire, we cannot leave the situation as it is, despite the moment of respite that is, long owed to the Palestinian people in Gaza and across the Palestinian occupied territories. The world cannot be gaslit into how much countries can and can't do to help the situation. This is probably the biggest rehabilitation and humanitarian effort needed in modern history. South Africa still has an outstanding case against Israel at the ICJ.
Yeah.
Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant still have warrants of arrest out from the ICC. There are, so many steps towards accountability, towards justice, towards the return of Palestinian people to their land and to their right to self-determination that still need to be achieved. And I think, there's only so much we can say, we can give to, the ceasefire process and the peace process without considering, well, there's a long, long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for unpacking that with us and helping us make some sense of the Hamas-Israel ceasefire and hostage release deal. That was international expert Aaliyah Vayez giving us some of those details.